Hello and welcome to the second episode of JudgeStone. We were a bit delayed by Hurricane Irma trying to mess up my stuff, but we are back this week for episode 2, so I am very glad to be back. I am, of course, joined by my good friend in Judgment Gaming, Owen. How you doing today, bud?
Hey, yeah, I can't complain. It's a sunny day in Las Vegas. So.
Very nice. Our normal host, Shinfitz, is currently unavailable. He may or may not be able to join us later in the show. Hopefully he can, but if not, Owen and I will just have to make do. We have a few things we want to talk about today. The main thing that we want to go over is tomorrow. The balance changes that were announced go live. I don't want to spend our time going over those changes directly, in that A, you and I have kind of both already done so, and B, I think it's been kind of talked to death. So instead, what I want to do is talk about the decks that are affected by these changes, and kind of where we see their power level moving forward. I will throw a quick caveat in here. I don't really have anything prepared for Shaman because the Hex change, honestly, A, is not that big a deal, and B, current Shaman decks don't play Hex anyway. So I think I'll let you go, Owen, real quick, if you have anything you want to say about how this affects Shaman in the long term, but I don't think we need to spend too much time on it.
Fair enough. So, basically the way that's going to affect the game in the long term is it just kind of brings like controlling Shaman decks single removal back in line with what Mage can do. So it'll basically just line up the card with Polymorph, and basically it's not really going to have that big of an impact. Aggressive decks are going to continue to not play Hex, and controlling decks are still going to continue to play it, because even at 4 mana, it's still a reasonably costed card. You see that Polymorph still sees play in controlling Mage decks, so I have no reason to expect that it'll change a whole lot. I think it's more so just bringing the cost of the effect kind of in line with what we come to expect in Hearthstone to pay for a silence effect.
Right. And also, for those worried about it, let us not also forget that Shaman still has a very powerful, a situationally powerful silence effect that only costs 2 mana. So, let's just remember that Devolve is still a card. So don't worry too much.
For a little while.
For a little while, yes. Don't worry too much about that.
One thing to definitely keep in mind, though, is that the change to Hex is a permanent one. It's going to be in the Classic set and in Standard forever, whereas Devolve will eventually cycle out. So while temporarily Shaman will have access to that powerful tool, for Standard at least, it's not going to always be the case, even though that will be true for Wild.
Right, so. Right. Okay, cool. So I think that's that. So let's move on to the things that we see that are going to be affected a little more significantly. So let's start with everybody's favorite deck, Jade Druid. There are 2 changes that affect this. Of course, Innervate only giving one mana crystal instead of 2, and Spreading Play going from 5 mana to 6 mana. So again, we don't want to talk about the individual card changes too much, but rather we can go with where we see Jade Druid's power level, where that's going to be starting tomorrow. What are your initial thoughts?
I mean, the story of the metagame coming up is just going to be whether or not a Priest or some other rogue deck is going to be able to unseat Jade Druid from the top of the metagame. As of right now, the deck is highly format warping and incredibly dominant, and it truthfully is the only thing that's keeping Priest in check right now. And my concern is, I think the concern that you have might share with me is that these changes are definitely going to make the deck weaker in a vacuum, but I think contextually the deck isn't going to lose enough to unseat it from the top of the metagame. And even so, I don't know if we really want to play in a metagame that's been unseated where Jade Druid isn't the top deck, given how powerful Razakis Priest currently is in Standard. So I'm going to expect this deck to probably continue to be one of the top decks, if not the top deck.
Okay. Yeah, I'm pretty much on the same page as you are. I definitely expect Jade Druid is still going to be very powerful. The Spreading Plague nerf matters, but I believe it was Sidonia, if I remember correctly, who said that it's not even that big a deal, because oftentimes you're not even trying to play it right on turn 5. You're playing it more as an answer to a specific problem. I don't know if I completely agree with that sentiment. There are times where playing on curve definitely matters, and coupled with the inability to innervate it out, because innervate A is probably going to see a whole lot less play just even being in the deck list, and B, even if it is, obviously doesn't do as much to cheat things out nearly as effectively. Sometimes, against like aggro, sometimes they have a really big board on turn 3 or turn 4, so being able to play the Spreading Plague earlier matters. So I don't know that I completely agree with the sentiment, but I understand the point behind it, and that sometimes it is just as powerful in the late game as it is in the early game. I definitely expect Jade Druid is still going to be very good. It might not be in its own tier, as it kind of is right now, but I do still think it will be a tier 1 deck. As far as your point of Rizakis Priest, yeah. It's going to challenge Jade Druid to be the best deck in the game. I can't say for sure which deck I think is overall going to claim that number 1 spot, but I think it's going to be a good battle between them. And for people who enjoy playing those decks, it's going to be a really good time to be playing Hearthstone. For people that don't enjoy playing against them, ladder might not be your best friend for a little while.
Yeah, and I think more to the point on the Spreading Plague nerf, not to harp too much on on how I disagree with the particular changes that were made. I do just want to say that yeah, of course it makes a difference in some early games, but I think overall I do agree with Sidonia that it's not even it is a major problem card in that it shores up the major hole in Druid's class weakness, but it's still not one of the major, it is a major player, but there were other things that were going on that I think Blizzard just opted to ignore, that I don't necessarily agree with. But again, we'll kind of see where it goes.
Yeah, according to their internal metrics, because they obviously have access to a whole lot more data than we do, they stated that Spreading Plague was actually possibly the single most powerful card in the deck, or the most overperforming card in the deck. With that said, and I will say one thing before we move on, I think it's something that we actually brought up last week, in that it's almost not really the nerf we were looking for, in that I think we discussed nerfing the Scarabs, not just on Spreading Plague, but all sources, so Scarabs, Malfurion, the Pestilent, on Druid of the Swarm, to nerfing down to 1/4 taunts instead of 1/5s. Because the 4 health breakpoint is actually huge. There's a huge difference. People think of Flame Strike immediately because, yeah, Flame Strike would be able to clear the board of Scarabs, when it's played. But it's also even just individual things like, say, a Kor'kron Elite, is able to punch through. And other things like this. The difference between 4 to 5 is actually extremely significant. And I think a lot of people would have been very happy to see all the Scarabs, and because obviously they want everything to be uniform. They want want some to be 1/5s, some to be 1/4s. But I think everyone would have been pretty happy to see all those Scarabs nerfed to 1/4s. I think they'd still be quite playable. And I will say that, particularly in the case of like Druid of the Swarm, a 2-mana 1/5 taunt is just a pretty good card. Like on its own, even in a vacuum. Like obviously it's been played more in Aggro Druid than Jade Druid, and we'll get to that in a moment. But the thing is, these are cards that are just good. And then they're choose ones on top of it, so they have flexibility, and like either way it's good. And it's providing Druid with a lot of flexibility and a lot of power in a lot of different places. And I don't think that these changes really affect that a whole lot. Now with that said, a lot of people were looking for a Jade Druid to just be destroyed, by whatever balance changes came up. And obviously that's not, A, that's not the direction the team was ever going to take. And B, I don't think it's a direction they should have taken. I don't like playing against this deck, therefore I want it out of the game, is particularly, usually not the right way to go. But I think they were looking to just tone it down in power. I just don't know if these changes are going to do that a whole lot, especially when some of Jade Druid's biggest counters were also nerfed. So let's actually run with that real quick. I'll go ahead.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I just have one other thing. I did want to mention that we did actually mention that on our last episode. That was a change I had suggested, and actually Brian Kibler had come out with a video not terribly long ago, where he kind of concurred that was, in his opinion, a good change that could have been, that he kind of thought should be made. So that's definitely something where I think that the difference between 4 health and 5 health, the difference between being able to soak, multiple true silver hits or,
Right.
being killed by one, it turns out that I think that it just absorbs way too much damage and really slows down the game to the point where Druid can, of course, take over. So,
Right.
yeah, still not really happy with that change. One other thing I did want to metrics that Blizzard uses. Now, we don't have a ton of information about exactly how they acquire the metrics, but they say that that's one of the overperforming cards, that, as they put it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm kind of curious how it is they determine that. Like, is it a matter of this card, correlates the highest to when I play this card, I win the game? Because that's a misleading metric to go by, as far as problematic cards are concerned.
Right.
So certainly, so a good example of this would be like Bloodlust, right? The games that Bloodlust is actually played, a disproportionate number of games end because of Bloodlust.
Sure.
But what you don't see are the games where you die with multiple Bloodlusts in your hand. So I think that, I'm sure they go over a lot of different metrics, but if they're, depending on how they're going over that, and again, it's just a kind of a consistent problem with Blizzard in that they have a lack of transparency with the way they make their decisions. My concern is perhaps they looked at Spreading Plague and said, oh, well, when the Druid player plays Spreading Plague, he wins an additional 35% of the time. That's way more than Ultimate Infestation, or, some other card in the deck, like, Wild Growth or whatever. And the thing is, well, yeah, because the games that you play, Spreading Plague, those games are really, when you play it, it's really important, or it just sits in your hand and you never play it because it's not good. So it's how are they taking into account the number of games where the card sits in your hand and doesn't do anything because it's a slower game, versus the number of games where you have to play it and it, completely stonewalls the aggressive deck. I'm not saying that it wasn't a problem. My concern is without knowing how they gather that data, we can't know if there's a hole in their methodology, which could have led them to overlook a card like Ultimate Infestation, which may also have a really high, impact on the game, but maybe not as high, in the games where it's played versus, games where it's not, I guess. I'm kind of muddling my,
I understand
I'm kind of communicating it.
Yeah, and I understand what you're saying. And I don't know. Obviously, we don't have that information of exactly what their metrics are. I don't believe that they would oversimplify things like that, because you're absolutely correct that just card played to win percentage is not the be-all end-all of is this card overpowered. I don't believe that's all they look at. I would certainly hope not. But yeah, as you said, there's really no transparency. They really don't know exactly what they're looking at. We got what we got. We may not agree with exactly how the card was nerfed, but at least it was nerfed in some way. So I guess we'll take what we can get right now. So let's move on to our next one. We talked about some Jade Druid counters, and one of those, of course, is still in the Druid family, which is the Token or Aggro Druid. This is a deck that I personally have played a lot of, except for the current meta. So I've played it in many seasons before this, in different iterations. I've been playing Token Druid since before Standard came out, when Jackie Chan first started getting some visibility with his Egg Druid. I actually picked that up right away, and I've been playing some variation of the deck ever since. So yes, there's some irony in the fact that when the deck is probably the strongest it's ever been is when I haven't been playing it. But I've always enjoyed the deck a lot. So we have to talk about where its power level is going to be right now. I said, I think, in my video about the balance changes themselves, that I feel that the Innervate nerf actually hits Token Druid harder than it does Jade Druid. Token Druid does not run ramp. Token Druid does not really run card draw. Token Druid relies on getting just a lot of stuff on the board very quickly that the opponent just can't deal with. So that, might involve things like, say, a turn 1 Vicious Fledgling off of Innervate, or a turn 2 or 3, depending if you have the coin, a Bittertide Hydra. Or kind of dumping your hand and then using Innervate to use the buffs like Mark of the Lotus or Power of the Wilds to, create that overwhelming board. Innervate is a big card for Token Druid. Don't get me wrong, it has a lot of use in Jade Druid as well, but I think that's kind of the point why the card need to be nerfed, because it has a lot of use in every Druid deck. So you don't build a Druid deck and say, nah, Innervate wouldn't do anything for me. But it hits Token Druid pretty hard. Now, that's the only specific card that was nerfed for Token Druid. I don't think the deck becomes unplayable. I do think it loses a lot of power. It might still be, say, like a tier 2, maybe low tier 2 deck. I think it still has some viability. It probably is still able to compete with some other aggro decks, but losing its ability to create extremely fast starts through Innervate, because those are generally the games where you just blow your opponent out, or when you have Innervate early into a threat. And again, with no card draw, if you're stuck just playing basically a quote-unquote fair game, where you can basically play one minion maybe on curve, or one small minion plus a board buff, the deck really is not nearly as scary. I mean, like I said, in the games that I've played, it's those games where I do just have to kind of play fairly, that my opponent has enough time to react and overrun what I'm doing. Because with Token Druid, if you're losing the board and you're just losing your cards and your opponent's building up a board, you usually don't have a good way of winning those games. So my prediction is that Token Druid is not gone. Mark of the Lotus is still a very good card. I don't think the deck just disappears, but I do think it drops out of tier 1 status.
I'm going to disagree with you there. I don't think that... I agree that the hit to Innervate definitely affects the deck a lot, but I don't think that it affects the token deck more than it affects the ramp, Jade Druid. I think both decks are really maximizing that card, but in two very different ways. Whereas Token Druid is aiming to maximize it by effectively getting extra mana in a game, early on, and outpacing the opponent that way. The Jade Druid deck still does that. The difference between playing Ultimate Infestation on turn, like assuming that you don't ramp at all on turn 8 versus turn 10 is a huge difference, or playing a Nourish on turn 3 versus turn 5. So while you're doing very different things with Innervate, I think that the thread through those two decks is that it's still a very key and, frankly unfair card.
Yeah.
That had to be changed. So I do disagree. I don't think it hits either deck harder than the other one. I think both were leaning pretty heavily on it. I think that Token Druid still has the ability to maximize Innervate after the change. Having extra copies of Coin is still good. You're still going to have access to a lot of similar plays that you would have had, before the change to it. You're not going to be able to turn one Vicious Fledgling, of course, without multiple coins. And that did lead to a couple, games where, you just won the game because you snowballed it from there. But I would argue that if what Token Druid loses is access to, essentially non-games of Hearthstone, I think that's overall better for the game. I mean, the deck's going to lose a few percentage points, certainly, and I think that the real reason the deck is not going to be as strong as it was has less to do with the change to Innervate and more to the, more with the changes to the texture of the metagame, in that aggressive decks are going to be stonewalled by the existence of cards like Spreading Plague and the prevalence of, priest decks that have the ability to clear away lots of small boards.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so your overall prediction as to where Token Druid lands?
Overall, I think that it's still going to be one of the best aggro decks. But again, with the caveat that I don't think aggro decks are going to be particularly impressive coming up in the new metagame. Just because I still don't think that they really have the pushing power that they need in order to climb over a wall of scarabs.
Right. So, with that said, and maybe it's a little early, but I mean, given you said, I'm going to pose the question that I half-jokingly posed at the end of the first episode, which was, are we arriving at that mythical Hearthstone control meta?
And I'm going to kind of reiterate my point, my stance. I think we were already at that metagame in the first place. I would argue that Jade Druid is a control deck, albeit a very proactive one, but still a control deck nevertheless. It aims to draw out the game and kill the opponent in the extreme late game. If that's not what a control deck is, then I don't know how else to define one. And to be honest, we're already there. We've been experiencing a control metagame for the last month ever since Knights of the Frozen Throne released, because, we're at a point where the top decks in the metagame are a controlling priest deck that cycles through its, its whole 30 cards to try and burn you out, and a controlling druid deck that, has the ability to create a hypothetically unlimited, stream of monsters. So I would argue that we're already here. Just because it's a control meta doesn't mean that actors are supposed to be ineffective entirely. And I think that, what we had right now, prior to the change, albeit a very warped metagame,
Okay, so that was kind of unexpected. We had a little bit of technical issues. My internet decided it didn't feel like working for a little bit, but we are back, so we'll let Owen get back to finishing his point before we move on to our next deck.
Right, so basically what I was just kind of getting at is that I think that we're already at that control metagame. I don't think it was a myth. I think it's, something that we actually have achieved, and I don't think it was that great for the game. And my concern is that compared to where the metagame is going, I think that we actually have a healthier metagame now than what it will be in a month from now, after the changes, because I don't think that they've done enough to stymie the development of control decks. It's my opinion that while I do enjoy personally playing control decks, that if your metagame does not allow for aggressive or tempo style decks, that you have a failed metagame, because you should be able to accommodate those types of players. So honestly, I'm a bit concerned about where we're going. I think that we've already reached the control metagame, and I don't think it was that great, to be honest.
Yeah, I find it hard to argue with you there. I'm pretty much right with you. All right, so let's move on to our next deck, and I'll let you take first crack at this one. Looking at Murloc Paladin. Of course, the changes to that Murloc War Leader now only grants +2 attack, no longer grants health. What are your thoughts on the state of Murloc Paladin going forward?
Not optimistic. We've kind of, beaten the dead horse here, but I don't believe that aggressive decks are going to be particularly powerful, and I think that the change to the Murloc War Leader's health buff is pretty big as far as Paladin's ability and Murloc ability in general, to withstand board clears. That one health is the difference between Murloc surviving cards like Blizzard, Volcanic Potion, Consecration, and other 2 damage AoE that is rather prevalent in the game in general. It's a huge breakpoint. It allows your lower drop Murlocs to trade favorably into higher costed minions, and I think that the deck will still be a very powerful snowball-y kind of aggressive deck, but it loses a lot of the resilience that the health buff granted. So as a deck, I think it still will have some power, but I think that it loses a lot of oomph there, and I think that similar to kind of my stance on Token Druid, I think the deck will still be good, but I think that it will certainly have to evolve to try and make up for that loss of power. How I feel that Token Druid will have to evolve to make up for the loss of power from Innervate. I think that Murloc Paladin will also have to do the same.
Right. Yeah, I say basically the same way. What's interesting is that Murloc Paladin started the Frozen Throne era as one of the strongest decks in the metagame, and was a pretty good counter for Jade Druid. And actually, as time has gone on, leading up to now, even before the changes, it's still a very good deck, but it's not showing quite the same level of performance that it was before. So it's funny because the game has actually, or the people playing the game has actually somewhat already adjusted to the presence of Murloc Paladin, to the point where it's still very strong but not overbearing. So right now it's argued either as a low tier 1, maybe high tier 2 deck before the changes. So yeah, I agree with you. I think that given that that's the case, any nerf to it, particularly its ability to stay on the board and to get favorable trades, is going to be significant, and something that players who want to keep trying to make the deck work are definitely going to have to adjust for. I will say that the initial version of Murloc Paladin that I played, was what I really liked about it was it wasn't ultra aggressive in the opening. Like, it didn't run Grimscale Chums. Did run multiple 1-drops, in Murloc Tidecaller and Vilephan Inquisitor. But it actually played for a very strong mid-game. It even had some late game with things, like Bone Mares, Tyrion, that kind of thing. And I wonder if that can still work when you're not able to snowball your early board quite as hard. You're not quite as aggressive in the opening, so you can come back a little bit easier than the deck that's just going all in on like turn 2, turn 3-ish. But when you're not able to keep your early board as much, I wonder if that's still going to work. So let me quick pick your brain as probably the person I know has played the most Paladin. 2 quick questions, which is A, can a slightly slower style of Murloc Paladin work that isn't quite as aggressive, but is still able to get some stuff on the board and then try to buff it or keep it there? Spikered Steed, Blessing of Kings, Bone Mare, whatever. That still can take advantage of some of the power of things like Finge of the Flying Star, General Megasaur, that kind of thing. Is that viable? And then my second question is, if it's not as good, is just straight control paladin or combo control paladin with Beardo and Uther a better choice at this point?
All right, so that's a multi-tiered question that I
Yes.
have a lot of different thoughts on.
I don't like to make things easy
as
for
far
you.
as so we'll just kind of tackle it one step at a time here. So the way that that Murloc Paladin decks generally function now, a lot of them have been moving towards more aggressive stances, what with the chums and whatnot. And I've actually seen a lot of builds cut Finja entirely, simply because it's slower than the kind of game they want to play. So, I think that as the deck evolves, we'll probably maintain that core package of Murlocs of like a pair of War Leaders, probably a pair of War Leaders, a pair of Hydrologists, and then from there, I'm expecting that probably gravitate more to Finja, who is really good on curve from going 5 on Finja, 6 into Spike Ridge Steed. It's difficult to remove a 4 health stealth minion on that turn. So I think that outside of like Flame Strike. So I think that it's a really good spot for that strategy in particular, slowing it down, starting to include cards like Finja again. I could even see a version of the deck trying to include, perhaps copies of Bluegill Warrior as well, moving back toward that direction, instead of trying to snowball cards like Tidecaller. Because I don't think that, Tidecaller certainly has the ability to push a lot of damage, but if it's never getting the health buff from War Leader, I don't know if it's going to be strong enough. But that being said, I do think that the deck still has some legs to stand on aggressively, because Rockpool Hunter is still a card that buffs health, and being able to curve your 1 mana 1/2 into, your 2 mana 2/3 that then turns it into a 3/3. I still think it's going to be really powerful. So I expect the deck is going to slow down a bit. I would expect to see the chums start to get cut in favor of perhaps a little bit more of a mid-game or slower oriented strategy. And, that interests me, certainly. But again, my problem is that I don't think that mid-range decks are going to be particularly effective in this metagame, because I don't think they're going to be able to... Basically, if the aggressive decks aren't fast enough to kill control decks, the mid-game decks are not going to be fast enough to kill the control decks either. So, it's kind of interesting to see where the metagame's going to go there. I think that, the deck may still have some legs to stand on, but it'll definitely have to take a slower form. I don't know that it's going to be able to maintain the, where it is and still be able to be resilient to aggressive decks. That being said, I do expect the metagame to slow down. As aggressive decks become less and less popular, the control decks may be able to get greedier and greedier, which then may allow for, the faster aggressive decks to swoop in and, get some free wins that way.
Right.
The main problem that like Beardo, OTK / controlling Paladin decks have right now is that as a combo deck, it simply lacks the cycling necessary for it to be fast enough to compete with, the slower deck, with the Jade Druid and Rizakis Priest. Jade Druid specifically, has the ability to pressure its life total, through just boards that it has to continuously try and clear, and Paladin doesn't really have a ton of ways to do that. Moreover, its way to clear the board is a 2-card combination, which often means that, you need to be able to recoup those cards. Back when Solemn Vigil was around, controlling Paladin decks were able to lean on that card to really, refill their hand and burn through their deck.
Right.
So I would expect that that'll still continue to be a problem. One of the big things that's facing Control Paladin right now is the fact that it doesn't handle aggression very well. So as the metagame slows down, I expect the deck will get a little bit better, but it still, I don't think, has the raw speed needed to be able to fight on the axis that Rizakis Priest can, which is ultimately really problematic for the deck if it wants to be a serious contender going forward.
Right. Okay. Good deal. Thank you. All right, so we're going to move on to the last card / decks that were affected. Warning to our viewers: rant from Justice incoming. So, let's take a look.
I get that warning too.
No, you should be well aware of it by now. So we're gonna look at Warrior. Specifically, we're gonna look at Pirate Warrior. I'll touch on Control a little bit, but so it looks at Pirate Warrior because, Fiery War Axe was changed, that instead of costing 2 mana, it costs 3. I'm not going to go over everything that I went over in my video because I don't want to focus on that too much. I will say that I may be in the minority in the community, and I'm okay with that. I am not a fan of the change, not because I think War Axe was a perfectly fine card as it was. I do think it was probably one of the strongest cards in the game, and given that it was in the classic set and will be around forever, I understand the desire to not have your classic cards be this must be in every deck forever for the end of time. I get that. I do think that they gave two big reasons as to why they wanted to change it, both of which I think were utterly garbage, and that's kind of where my problem comes from, because they talked about a change in mana cost being more visible while the card is in your hand for players that aren't paying attention to card changes. That's been talked about a lot in the community, but obviously that's utter nonsense. Again, when any card change is made...
If I may, just interject there.
Sure.
I think that this is a matter where the messaging was a bit mumbled, like from Blizzard at least. That is what they stated, but I think what the point was is that they were going to make a change to it.
No, I understand what the point was. Just I'm just going through what they stated and why there was some negativity received in the community. I know that wasn't their main reason of doing what they did. I understand that. What I am saying is that the way in which they deliver their message obviously needs work. Because that was a consideration. It was not the reason why they changed the card. It was not the reason why they thought, hey, let's do this or let's do that. But the way they delivered their message was not good. So there was that. And then they also talk about, that the strength of Pirate Warrior. And, and feeling that deck could stand to take a hit. So I have multiple thoughts on that front. Pirate Warrior is a deck that's already lived out a good portion of its lifespan before some key cards rotate out standard. Now, yes, obviously they're still wild, but that's just one thing to consider, is that we're well into Pirate Warrior's standard lifespan in any case. B, it's a deck that they themselves have pushed. No one forced Blizzard to make a card like Bloodsail Cultist, which is very specifically for Pirate Warrior archetype. So I find it odd that even when the deck had, obviously it really took off after that point, but, it just seems weird to try to push a certain archetype and then say, whoa, wait a minute, a few months later, we didn't think it was going to be that good. So it's just interesting. But the thing is, as I said, I understand War Axe is a very powerful card. I understand that being in the classic set means it's around forever, and that could be a discussion for another time of, how great an idea that is. But I understand why a change needed to be made. I think that, you know what? I said I didn't want to go too far into the card-specific part, and that's exactly what I'm doing. So I'm going to pivot now. I'm going to catch myself in what I'm doing, and I'm going to pivot to how this affects Pirate Warrior. Much like, I think, Aggro Druid, I don't think Pirate Warrior goes away because of this change. I don't think it suddenly becomes a tier 4 deck or anything like that. I do think that it definitely suffers from the change, but they wanted it to. They stated specifically they did want to hit Pirate Warrior because of it. Pirate Warrior has exactly 2 different cards right now that it plays on turn 2, which is either Fiery War Axe or Bloodsail Raider. So when you take one of those away, now a deck that needs to be playing for the early game has exactly 2 cards out of 30 that are played on curve on turn 2. I've been playing a lot of Pirate Warrior for a few seasons now. Surprisingly, because I've never really been much of an aggro player, but the deck just it works for me. I don't know, I enjoy it. And I will say that the games where you don't have a lot to do on turn 2 are ones that usually become very difficult to win. So not only is it making it more difficult for you to curve out, which an aggressive deck usually needs to do, it also takes away one of your main answers to a lot of early plays that your opponent can make, such as a turn 1 Northshire Cleric from Priest, or turn 1 Mana Worm from Mage. These types of things. Usually, being able to play a War Axe on 2 or coining out a War Axe on 1 is a way that you can prevent your opponent from snowballing their early game so that you can overwhelm them in the following few turns. Taking that away, while also as I said, making it very difficult for Pirate Warrior to curve out, actually hurts the deck quite a bit. Now there are options to try to fill that hole. I mean, there's cards you can play. So like I've actually been experimenting with, say, one copy of Forge of Souls in my deck, which is a card that not a lot of Pirate Warriors are playing. I have mixed feelings about it. I think it might be okay. But playing a card that just draws from your deck on turn 2 and doesn't affect the board in any way in an aggressive deck is not your ideal scenario. There's also, I've heard some talk of, including things like, say, Firefly, which isn't bad. In fact, before Knights of the Frozen Throne, some versions of Pirate Warrior were running a single copy of Firefly anyway. So it's definitely not bad. I've heard some suggestions of things like Fairy Dragon or whatever, just as strong a 2-drop as you can get. But I think it kind of highlights the point of what a big change it is when you're saying, well, play a 1-drop instead or play a Fairy Dragon instead is the solution to what Pirate Warrior plays instead of War Axe. So, to sum up, I don't think the deck disappears. I don't think it becomes bottom of the barrel. But I definitely think it takes a large hit, and I think some of the decks that were susceptible to aggro are going to be very happy to see this change made.
You and I actually disagree on a lot of points here. I actually disagree by a lot, both with my perception of the change itself and the impact that it'll have on the metagame. I think that, honestly, of all the changes that were announced, this is the one that I'm happiest about. Not because of what it does to... Well, yes, but I think a lot of people are happy for different reasons. They're happy because they feel like, oh, this card's been broken for a long time, it's been very overpowered. Those things are also true. But for me, it's less a matter of happy to see the card go because I'm frustrated to play against it. I think that from a power level perspective, this kind of card can still exist and not, like, stifle the metagame too much. But what I do think it does is it eats up a ton of design space. And I think by removing that card from, basically bringing that card to more in line with the kind of stats that are accepted, I think is definitely a good thing. I like that it's going to 3 mana, 3/2. I understand there are complaints that it's, just a bad rallying blade, quote unquote. But this is a classic card that's going to be around forever. And a big problem that Warrior has, and I think the community is starting to realize it, or is seeing it now, is that once War Axe goes away, it's becoming obvious that the reason that Warrior has never received strong 2-drop cards, or, strong 3-drop like weapons or anything like that, is because Fiery War Axe existed. As long as that 2-drop exists for Warrior as a class, it is impossible to print any strong weapons for turn 3, any strong weapons for turn 2, any strong minions for turn 2, because the card would simply have to compete with, pound for pound, one of the best cards ever printed in the game, period. I don't think it's hyperbolic to state that I think Fiery War Axe today is the strongest card in the game, for what you're buying mana-wise, from a mana efficiency standpoint. The flexibility and the power is unrivaled. And so I think that the change is a great one that I'm really happy to see. But I think I do disagree with making the changes now, if you're going to make the change at all. And I disagree with kind of the implementation. I think that a big thing that is kind of being overlooked is the damage that this will do to the Wild metagame. As far as Wild is concerned, Pirate Warrior is kind of the only real aggressive deck that's tier 1, or really strong, keeps the metagame honest. And I think that change to War Axe hurts the deck a lot more than I think you're giving it credit for. I think that the deck does virtually disappear without it, because I don't think that the class has access to the kind of 2-drops that synergize well to keep that deck around. And I think with evolution, the deck may survive in some form, but it's certainly not going to be the hyper-aggressive deck that we have today. It's going to be a slower mid-range deck, in my opinion. That's going to still try and close out the game with Arcanite Reapers, perhaps. But, again, it's a very different deck at this point, because now we're trying to... Fairy Dragon's not a terrible card, but it doesn't synergize with what you're trying to do outside of a minion that can apply pressure. So, my opinion is that I'm really pleased about the change, because I think it opens up a lot of new design space to Warrior that I think the class has really suffered for with the 3/2 for 2-mana weapon that it's had previously. And I think that going forward, it's a fine change, because even though it is right now a bad Rallying Blade isn't a card that's going to be around forever, whereas Fiery War Axe always will be. There will come a time in Standard where Paladin doesn't have access to a 3-mana 3/2 weapon. There will be a time, where, Hunter, Hunter will always have Eaglehorn Bow, but that class and Warrior function very differently with the way that they have to apply it.
Right.
Because Warrior's hero power buffers your health and makes it easier to utilize your weapons to clear minions. So, again, it's a change I'm really happy about. I think the overall impact is that this is going to virtually kill Pyro Warrior for the metagame. I don't suspect it'll be a powerful player going forward, not just because of the change itself, but because I don't think that the decks that it's trying to kill early enough are really going to have a hard enough time trying to stop it. I think that that's a huge change, and I don't think the deck is going to be a major player going forward.
Yeah. Well, you said you disagree with me, and basically you agree with me. You just agree with me more than I do, but that's fine. So we're both on the same page that this is a huge deal for Pirate Warrior. I will put it out there too that for classic Control Warrior, it also really matters because Fireworks was the way that they were generally able to try to get through their early turns to get to the late game. So we talk about Pirate Warrior since it's definitely the significantly much more prevalent deck at the moment. But I know people like Fibonacci, who is probably the most well-known Control Warrior player in the world, was extremely upset about wanting to hurt pirates and therefore hurting all warrior archetypes at the same time. I don't want to get into that whole debate right now because we're actually running a little late on time here, so I want to continue. But just something for the audience to think about. Mm-hmm.
Right, and I do just want to point out, I think that Fibonacci's being a bit hyperbolic here. I think that Control Warrior survives just fine. Not being able to play War Axe on 2 certainly hurts, but I think that opening up the design space and the ability to print stronger cards on turn 2 for Warrior will allow the class to thrive later on. Certainly now it's a problem, but it's not impossible to build a controlling Warrior deck with a 3-mana Fiery War Axe. We have the Deadman Fatigue Warrior that exists now, and it doesn't even play it in some iterations.
Right. So
I think that Fibonacci's being a bit hyperbolic, and I think that's more of just like a gut reaction that he had to having a strong tool that he had access to for 3 years taken away from him. I don't agree with him at all, and I understand he's a well-regarded Control Warrior player, the best, but I think that he's being a bit close-minded here.
Yeah, I think that kind of what you're saying though is actually extremely relevant. Is with this change, what are they going to print in the future? And I think that'll have a lot to do with it. Okay, so those are the main decks that are currently prevalent that have been affected by these changes, which brings us to our next question, and we'll try to run through this fairly quickly, which is, do you have any decks... well, actually, I'll combine the 2 questions, just for time efficiency's sake, which is, do you have any decks that you think are not currently seeing play that will get a bump and might start seeing play after these changes? And the second part of that question is, what are you looking forward to playing after these changes? So I'll let you go first on that, and then I'll give my input.
Sure. So for decks that don't currently see play that will begin to see more play, honestly, I don't really think of any, because I think that a lot of the problems right now is that the decks that see play right now, I guess controlling Paladin is the only thing that comes to mind as far as decks that don't currently see a lot of play. And well, hello, will in the future, just because I think that without all of the aggressive decks running around, being stifled by the oppressing Jade and Priest metagame, I think that those aggressive decks will kind of taper out a little bit and give Paladin a chance to be a little bit greedier with its late game, which will allow it to compete a little bit easier with Priest. Because I think part of the problem right now is that all of those early game aggressive tools are not powerful enough against Priest, and so it runs out of stuff to do that's relevant, and the Priest deck can burn them out at their leisure. So that's kind of my thought on like a deck that I'm looking forward to seeing a little bit more of. What was the second part of the question exactly?
What are you looking forward to playing after the balance changes that maybe you felt like you couldn't yet, or just something different?
Well, initially, immediately after the change was made, I was thinking, oh, I could play more Quest Mage. But I don't think that deck is going to really see the kind of resurgence that I would like, just because I think it's a very techable... Like, you can tech against it pretty easily. The cards like Dirty Rat make it very difficult to play against. And, you can certainly make the deck a bit greedier and a little bit better that way by, including less anti-aggro tools if you need to. But again, I think that it's definitely like the prevalence of Dirty Rat, the fact that Cold Light Oracle is seeing a lot of play now, like unusually a lot of play,
Right.
which means that it's inherently risky to have a strategy that relies on particular cards. And the fact that the Lich King is a minion that exists that occasionally gives them a 2-mana spell that just steals your win condition,
Yes.
like nabbing your Archmage Antonidas out of your deck. I've had that happen to me once before. And I tell you, every time they play the Lich King, my blood pressure goes up because I don't know whether or not they're going to get
Death grip.
they're going to get the Death Grip, yeah, or and even cards like Frostmourne give face reach to classes that normally don't have it, and
Right.
also poses a huge problem. So I think that Quest Mage is definitely pretty easily kept in check with that, because if it ever becomes a problem, there are enough tools that exist currently to make it dicey enough that it'll never see a super high win percentage. So that's kind of my thought on that, even though I would like to play the deck more. Other than that, I guess like controlling mage decks are kind of cool. So I think Frost Lich Jaina is really strong.
Yeah.
But kind of more to my point though, actually, just kind of expanding on the reliance on individual cards. I think that's two of the reasons why the Jade and Priest decks are so powerful, is because all of their of the decks, like the decks are pretty homogenous. Like they don't rely on particular cards all too much. The Rozaka's Priest deck, of course, a lot more relies on Shadow Reaper Anduin's power to close out the game more than anything, especially in combination with Raza. But I think that like the deck's reliance on, like, the fact that Reaper Anduin isn't affected by Dirty Rat means that, like, effectively the only way you can really fight against it is by trying to burn it with Cold Light Oracle, which is something you can still try and avoid by just playing your cards, not holding a big hand. So, and I think that, Jade Druid, a lot of the cards just do the same thing, so it's difficult to fight against a particular part of that strategy. So I think that that's, another element as to why those decks are powerful, is because a lot of the cards are, like kind of replicas of each other. Like
Right.
a lot of them do the same thing.
Right. Okay. Cool.
So how about you, man? Any decks that you're looking forward to playing that you think will be better upcoming, or any decks that or anything like that?
So I will say I will first state one thing that I think is not currently seeing play that will. I don't know if I'll be the one playing it or not. I'm actually going to throw something out there, which is Silence Priest, because a well-constructed Silence Priest deck actually has a favorable matchup against both Jade Druid and Rozaka's Priest.
Actually,
at 50-50 at worst. What?
I actually disagree. It doesn't. I don't think it has a favorable matchup against Silence Priest against Rozaka's Priest at all.
It's somewhat draw dependent, but let me put it this way: it has a much better matchup against it than a lot of other things you could be playing, and better than you might think, because they only have one of each of their answers. If they can't get it early, Silence Priest is a deck that can win on turn 4 or turn 5. So it has as good a matchup as basically anything else you could be playing. I think, again, as we said, I think Rozaka's Priest is just going to be better than most things. So having a deck that even maybe is 45% against it is still better than most other decks out there. So I think it's reasonable. It actually is somewhat, not by a ton, but has a decently favorable matchup against Jade Druid as well. I don't think it's suddenly going to become tier 1 or anything, but I think it'll be, if nothing else, a fun tech deck for people to try to ladder with, that they might see more success with than they might expect. So I think that's something that could come out of the woodwork a little bit. As far as for what I want to play, I am making no claims as to how good I think it's going to be. I think it will be slightly better after these changes, which is going to be Hand Buff Paladin. It's actually already a somewhat reasonable deck right now, and I think that taking away some of the aggro in Token Druid and Pirate Warrior will actually go a long way towards helping the deck, since it obviously just wants to get past its first few turns, buff some things up, and then try to overtake the board. So it's going to be fun. I'm going to have to craft me a Prince Kaliseth, but that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make. I'm going to try a few different versions of it. I'm actually going to try to go all in with the Corpse Taker Stormwatcher package that a lot of Murloc Paladins are actually currently running. Because I think that buffing those, because like you never really want to draw your Stormwatcher, but I mean, it's a 4/8 Wind Fury, so if that becomes suddenly like a 5/10 Wind Fury, it's just that much scarier, or 5/9 Wind Fury, it's just that much scarier. But obviously buffing Corpse Takers that have, Taunt, Divine Shield, Lifesteal, Wind Fury, and buffs on them on top of that is obviously, it's not going to happen every game, but it's pretty exciting when you think about it. So I'm going to try it. Yeah, as I said, it's a deck that is already... It's not on a lot of people's radars, and it's not tier 1 by any means, but it's certainly better than I think a lot of people realize. I know, obviously, one of our favorite people, Brian Kibler, has been a big advocate of the fact that the deck is actually pretty legit right now. And I think that when you get rid of some of the aggro that's been prevalent on the ladder, it just gets a little bit better. So I don't know what the results are going to be, but it's definitely something that I'm excited to try.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I honestly have been looking at crafting a Killer Seth myself, because I am a big fan of Paladin as a class in general. So I think I'm coming up on my 900th win in ranked with that class. So,
Nice.
I'm looking forward to certainly playing more of it. If the metagame is kind to it. The big concern is always going to be the fact that just that priest deck is incredibly powerful and very difficult to overcome. You can beat the Jade Druid deck if you can build a large enough board proactively enough, but the Shadow Reaper Anduin Battlecry makes that strategy just not very good. So it's almost like in order to beat either of the two decks, you kind of need to do two very different things, and finding a deck that's capable of both going tall against the Jade Druid deck fast enough, but also capable of being able to like reflood the board consistently enough to fight against all the AoE that Shadow Reaper Anduin has, and do that quickly. Like, I feel like those are two like very different things that you want your deck to do. So, it'll be interesting to see, because right now I don't really know that any deck has that ability, as of right now. But who knows? Maybe without so many powerful aggressive decks in the metagame, it'll open up some doors to decks that weren't there before.
Yep. So that's my hope, but I'm gonna test it, and I will let you know. So
Yeah, actually, I did just have a thought though. Just one deck that I definitely haven't seen a lot of that I would like to see a little bit more of is a controlling shaman deck. I think that shaman has a lot of interesting tools available to it that I haven't really seen anybody give any thought to. You and I are both familiar with like the old like big shaman deck where you just ancestral spirit your giant top minion.
Right.
And the problem is that priest does have a bunch of silence effects, so that's not great. But it's not terrible. So I'm kind of curious to try that out a little bit and tinker with that.
Okay. I think that's fair, for sure. I mean, even if you ancestral spirit out, like, say, an Earth Elemental and they silence it, it's still a 7/8 that you got out, for 4 mana and no overload. So, like, it's not the worst thing.
Right, and now there's also a minion that says Battle Cry, give that ability to a guy. So it's a 5 mana 3 that does it as a Battle Cry. So you actually have more copies of that effect in your deck. So if you're looking to like grind extra value out of it, like I would be interested to see what a deck looks like that's trying to like duplicate Aya a bunch of times, or do that on a bunch of relevant top minions. So because that's the kind of game plan where if you do that to like a Bog Creeper or something, and they play their Shadow Reaper, that doesn't clear the Bog Creeper. You still have your 7/8 afterwards. So it really pressures them to find both the silence effect to get rid of the ancestral, as well as a way to clear away the minions. So I don't know, that's definitely a deck that I think definitely has some legs on it. Currently it's a bit stymied by I think all of the really powerful aggressive decks, because while Shaman does have a lot of anti-aggression tools, it's not the best at it. Because like you have to crane your deck with so many anti-aggression tools that you don't really have the ability to get greedy enough to beat the control decks.
Right.
So again, just like off the top of my head, that was another deck that I'm kind of interested to see if anybody explores.
Nice. And I will say, to your point, I think that Control Mage is at least worth trying. Again, hard to say where it's gonna end up, but I think it's at least worth trying. And even if it has, say, an unfavored matchup against Rosakna's Priest, which it probably does, there's still a lot of other decks that you can probably beat. So I don't know. I think it'll be fun.
Absolutely.
Alrighty, so that will wrap things up for us today. So I do hope you guys enjoyed the episode. Don't forget to check us out just all over the place. We do have our Judgment Gaming website, which is jdggaming.com. Check out the Judgment Gaming YouTube channel, our Facebook page. We do have our Twitter handles here on the stream. So just connect with us. If you guys have any questions, any thoughts on anything that we've discussed today, we're always happy to connect with you on social media. But yeah, let us know, how you think the current decks are going to end up after their nerfs, what decks you might be looking forward to playing as we move forward with these balance changes. So we will talk to you guys soon, and we'll see you next week.
Take care, guys.